Welcome. I'm your host, Charles Ellison of the bnote.com, and welcome to What Happens Next. So, as you know, these are our monthly musings on current events, what's happening in the world of politics and public policy, happening now, in the near future, and beyond. So, joining me here are my good friends and co-hosts, Stephen Hankin of Lincoln Park Strategies and Trendency, and Justin Wallen of J. Wallen Opinion Research. We took a break in January, of course, just getting over the holidays and digging ourselves out a little bit from Snow Creek, from that epic snowstorm. So good to see you both. How are you doing?
Great to see you. Excellent.
Good to see you.
Okay. All right. Good. So let's get on with it. Let's talk about nationalizing elections. A lot of conversation there. The president talking about or suggesting that we should nationalize elections. Now, so what that means is that essentially the federal government would have complete power over election administration. Once you would federalize it, now that power currently sits with the states. That's constitutionally mandated. But Trump has another idea. Where do you think that's coming from? I'll start with you first, Justin.
Well, I think we know where it's coming from. I mean, the president has a long history of deep distrust and combative, to say the least, interaction with state elections officials and outcomes. So, I mean, I think that's clearly where it's coming from. But in terms of where it's going, I don't know of any opinion research that deals with this issue. Stefan may have seen some may have conducted some, but I was unable to find anything about what do voters think about this. But typically, when we're talking about removing power from the state, and it is a shared power, right? It's not entirely up to the states; it's shared. The federal government has a very clear role in what is done, it's very clear that it has a role. It is very clear the states have a role, but there is a big gray area to the degree of that ebb and flow of those roles. Now, that said, when we start talking about taking power that the states have and shifting it to the federal government, that tends to be deeply unpopular with voters. Voters tend to kind of have that arc of approval. The highest is their local city council or town council, and then the equivalent of whatever the county governance is, and the state comes down here, and the federal government's all the way down here. So I can't imagine that being a terribly popular item, except outside of his core base. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems with the election system, right? There are. Republicans have accused election systems of fraud. Democrats have accused election systems of fraud, all at the highest level, at the presidential level. So it's not like one side can claim to be the victim here. Everyone claims to be the victim whenever they feel victimized. And state elections are messy and ugly, and they're problematic. But largely, is there systemic fraud? No one's ever found that. No one's ever found that when Republicans were charging that that elections were being turned in a meaningful way by undocumented Latinos, which was a big deal in the 90s, right? Nothing was found really in the Trump Biden, I mean, with the full weight and pressure of the United States government while he was still in office before he left prior to the last 4 years. There are problems, but are they the problems as the president describes them, to the scale and scope of them, that would require federalizing, and would that swing public opinion in his favor? I just struggle to see that being the case. But again, I don't have any data. Stefan may actually have some, and I'd sure love to hear about it.
Stefan, you have any data? And
yeah, no, I mean, I'll say early in the this most recent foray into the federal government should take over in these 15 areas that I'm not going to really name. Although it's a good question. I'll put it on our next national survey that's coming up and see what people say. But I mean, in general, right, like this is typically pretty low on voters' lists of things they're concerned about, right? I mean, putting food on the table, healthcare costs, getting your kids through school, like voting is not, for most people, up in the upper echelons of things they're worried about. But a lot of that is because the system is not perfect, but it has been pretty good. And to Justin's point, right, like there is no fraud, right? There's no massive fraud. You're talking a few individuals, if that, here and there, doing some bad things, but nothing that's turning an election.
So, okay, one likely scenario, or at least some game theory here, some experts saying that as we are in the throes of the 2026 election, if there's any hint that races are getting close and tighter on election night, potentially, say, the administration could deploy, say, either the military or National Guard troops to then go to polling places, collect ballots, and to count them themselves, have the administration count those ballots. That's when, folks are predicting, if it gets to that, this is just game theory, it's just a hypothetical, but when it gets to that, we'll have chaos. And, one expert saying that'll be the end of democracy. Justin, do we see some kind of scenario like that happening if indeed we get to some point where the elections are nationalized?
Well, I don't see the elections being nationalized. I don't see that passing muster. Certainly not on this Supreme Court, which is very much a state rights court. It's conservative, so it's very state rights oriented. And so they're de facto, I don't see rolling in with federal troops to polling places. I mean, we've seen some pretty dramatic things, but nothing comes even close to that scale and scope. I'd have to say that is, I can't possibly imagine that being a scenario that is realistic.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
no, I was gonna say, I also agree. I mean, right. I mean, because like the way that Trump gets away with things, right? It's like it's towing the line, then stepping across the line, but stepping across the line in a way that there's a way to sort of excuse the behavior from like the Supreme Court or other courts where they go, oh, well, like, yeah, it's okay. We're going to kind of use this excuse to sort of say that it's okay to do this. So I think I definitely agree with Justin that like, troops coming in and counting votes, I don't think, but, already questioning the validity of outcomes. Absolutely. Right. Do ICE agents show up in certain areas and just start milling about on election day? Would put money on it. And basically it's just causing not quite chaos, but certainly, getting people to, likely worry about these things while something else is going on that they're also mucking around with. Right now, you can also throw in, now that the FBI raided the election offices in Atlanta, like what the hell are they doing with those ballots? Are we making new ballots? Like, what are we doing here? Got questions on that one. Why is your national intelligence director participating in this raid? Lots of questions. But I think it's more the trying to already start, sow doubt among the true believers in the outcomes of the elections, and also just trying to create as many diversions as humanly possible so they can do other things.
Hey, just I'm real curious. Does this in any way impact the president's relationship with Republicans, and at least on this issue, because it's constitutional. This is Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, which fairly explicitly explicitly states that states determine the time, manner, place to which an election, or at least to which ballots are administered in congressional elections. So you did have Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who pushed back against this, when it was mentioned, saying, that's off the table. No, and there are a few other Republicans who are saying that this is something that the Constitution has already determined. How much does this influence their relationship with the president, especially if he keeps on bringing it up?
Well, I mean, to be clear, again, there's shared responsibility, right? Congress clearly has the capability to make or alter rules that the states abide by, right? So you're absolutely right. I mean, what you described is what the state has the right to do. States have the right to do. Congress has the right to jump in there and meddle. To be very clear about it, they can meddle. They can alter or change the rules that elections are conducted by. So, does anyone have hard and fast control? I mean, the states are subject to federal oversight. ultimately. That's not the same as nationalization of elections. I agree to your point, to your question. I agree with Stefan that I just don't think this is anywhere remotely close to people's concerns right now. As time goes on and this issue, if it builds, then maybe suddenly it becomes within the top 5 or at least a moment of concern. I just don't see this being a concern. I don't think this was on people's minds. I definitely don't see Republicans feeling any meaningfully differently than others. Although, of course, there is the base, and it goes without saying, the base will go with what the president says. They are very, very loyal to the president. But everyone else, I just don't see this being a huge issue that's occupying any time or lining up one way or another.
Okay, so consensus between you both that it's not a big issue for voters now, but Stefan, want to go back to 2 questions here, and Justin, I'll have you jump in. So one, how do Democrats, because there's some worry there, how do Democrats then frame the messaging to persuade voters that, hey, this is important, this is really critical? You're talking about like the federal government, and particularly a current federal government that still wants to toy around with unproven, already debunked theories and claims that the election was stolen from them in 2020. So that's one. How do they message this and make this a big deal? And 2, make this a big deal in the way suddenly redistricting was something that the public never was able to sort of, grab its collective heads around, so but now, the public kind of generally, for the most part, understands that. So, could you frame this nationalization of elections issue the same way, make it important to voters the same way you did redistricting?
Yes, although I'm trying to think if it'd be. So I'll call it I feel bad saying worth it, right? Because look, elections should be sacrosanct, right? Like this should be a trusted process where we all feel like, look, you go in, you get a chance to vote. It's not it's not hard to do, and whoever gets the most votes wins, right? Like that is something that has been the case for a really long time, and but now. And the reason why I'm sort of hesitating, I'm like, do you want to make this an issue or try to sort of full-throated issue, right? Is like there are just so many other things, right, and that do hit a little bit closer to home. And there are people getting killed in the streets in Minneapolis, right? I mean, there's what's happening in the economy, there are healthcare costs, there's a myriad of other things that hit people more directly and across the entire country that I'm going to say are probably politically better to focus on. Now, I'm not saying take your eye off the ball on this, and this is sort of should be talked about, should be brought up, but I would wrap it more around the, hey, we saw what happened in 2020 or early 2021, right? Trump is setting up for the same kind of thing here, lawless, going against the Constitution, and we're about to hit our 250th anniversary, and we have a president who is just like pissing and burning the Constitution down to the ground. Maybe not use those exact words, but that kind of avenue versus like a specific. Let's message around elections and the safety of elections and things like that. Small audience, and it's always harder to bring an issue up than it is to talk about the issues people already care about.
Yeah, just a good point from Stefan, because I think Democrats, especially with Vice President Harris's campaign in 2024, not really effective there, not really hitting the core. There was a lot of focus on, here's a very existential threat to democracy, the candidacy of Trump, the potential of a President Trump. And so that just didn't resonate with voters because they were just worried about affordability, about the cost of groceries, right? About the price of housing. So, I mean, I don't know, your thoughts, just kind of following up with Stefan before we go on to the next issue. Can you frame something like this in the same way you kind of were able to frame redistricting where people were paying attention?
Well, I think Kamala Harris's argument then failed because it was a failure of an argument, and I think if it was trying to be made now, it would also fail in spite of a significantly shifting degree, kind of landscape in terms of what people are willing to tolerate about the president's actions and the administration's actions. Right? So we elected a president that more people voted for than the option, and that president is conducting things which are in his purview to conduct and trying to conduct things that are in gray areas. And then that goes to the courts, and then the courts smack them down when they don't believe in them. And there's been a number of things that were, kind of not in the president's favor, as will happen. I just don't see that being a resonant message. I'm sure Republicans are hoping that that's the message that Democrats come out swinging with, because they'll lose. It's not what people are talking about. That people are still talking about affordability. There's two parts of that: stuff is too expensive, and incomes are too low to pay for those things that are too expensive. Right? Those are the two broad levers you've got to play with: bringing down costs, which is extremely difficult, and raising incomes, which is the byproduct of a healthy capitalist country. And presumably that would be something you could do more readily. Although neither of them you can flip a switch on. Immigration, that was an issue until the border issue was resolved, and it is largely resolved. Now immigration's an issue because more and more people think, ICE is going too far. I know I'm straying out of topic, but I mean, we have so many things to Stefan's point earlier of what's top of mind. To most Americans, the vulnerability of democracy isn't top of mind. It is in the New York Times, and it is to progressives, but that is a fraction of the population, just like the president's true believers represent a fraction of the population. The rest of people don't view the world that way.
On to the next issue, ICE. Everyone's talking about ICE. And, for Stefan, I want to go back to you on, just Americans' views of ICE. You did explore that in a recent Trinity survey. And so what are Americans' views on ICE? I mean, is it that important? Is it a top issue for Americans right now? Are Americans really that worried about ICE, about limitations, about the lack of limitations on how ICE is carrying out these different enforcement actions and deportations? How do Americans feel right now? And is it that important where it will have impact on future elections?
So, the way we asked the question was not just do you approve of ICE, do you disapprove of ICE, but we allowed people to give a little nuance where we said, okay, do you approve of what ICE, the goals of ICE and their tactics? Do you approve of the goals but not the tactics, or do you disapprove of both? And then what we found is about, in round numbers, about 30% are on board with the goals and the tactics. You had about 20% who are okay with the goals, definitely not the tactics. And then you have about 50% that are not okay with either. Now, so shockingly, this basically breaks out where mostly Democrats are on the I don't approve of either. The hardcore Trumpies, the full MAGAs are that 30% that support the tactics and the goals. And then you have 20%, which are sort of the non-MAGA Republicans, for lack of a better term, who are kind of in this camp of I might be okay with the overall goals, but definitely not on board with the tactics. And, to Justin's point, right? This has moved away from a border issue into now it's been pulled into American cities. And obviously ICE has not been draping themselves in glory with what has been going on in Minnesota, to say the least. And, you saw, and that we have videos of 2 American citizens being shot and killed. And, the first one, not my view, but there was a car, the car was moving. Whether that ICE agent was justified in shooting someone 3 times, I'm going to say no, but there's some information there that can make people question what happened. The second one was just a full-on execution. Unarmed person on the ground getting shot 6, 7, 8 times in the back. And yeah, this is Americans saw it, right? And this isn't somewhere in Texas on the border, or this is in Minneapolis, right? And the videos are out there, and so now this is hitting home with folks in a way that just hearing stories about things that were happening in Chicago or Portland or fill in your city, people were kind of against it, but it didn't really resonate and hit home. And now we're seeing it hit home due to the fact of what's happening in Minneapolis.
Yeah, Justin, is this an inflection point too for Republicans, for strong supporters of President Trump? I don't know if we can classify them as such as MAGA. I guess maybe like MAGA supporters of President Trump, at least on the gun rights issue, because Alex Petrie was a licensed gun owner. He had his gun on him. He had a license to carry. So he wasn't brandishing the arm. He didn't pull it out. But are you seeing an inflection point? Are you seeing something where this is dramatically changing people's support of Trump, or at the very least, dramatically changing people's support for the way that immigration enforcement is being carried out right now?
Two answers to that. So one at the kind of high level underlying Stefan's numbers, when 70% disapprove of tactics, I mean, that's just a massive number, right? And that's the problem here is tactics. That's overwhelmingly the problem. The president did not remove the ground commander and replace the ground commander because things were going well. So there's clearly questioning in the administration, and therefore, to some degree, amongst that core degree of support. I wouldn't put tremendous stock in that. I think the more important numbers are the numbers of that, what that 70% represents, because that, yes, it represents all, pretty much all Democratic voters, a good chunk of independents, and also a good chunk of Republicans. You don't get to 70 without including everybody. And those are the folks who are getting really uncomfortable with the way things are going. And they don't buy the arguments. This is the challenge that the administration has, and if they hadn't pivoted, we'll see what happens. The administration's argument, very, I think, clumsily put, has always been, well, if you're a sanctuary city, then you're making our lives difficult. It would be much easier, and we wouldn't have this degree of violence and collateral pickup if you gave us access to your jails, and we could do what we've said we're supposed to do. Since we can't do that, we have this almost negotiating tactic of going in with extreme force and picking up more people. The net's bigger, right? Because we're out in public. So other people are going to get caught up. The challenge with, I think there's a degree of tolerance for that amongst the more Republicans, the broad out of the base, up until the point where they saw things that were very clearly poorly handled. Republicans believe that if you carry a gun, you have a responsibility with it. That's core to the ownership of gun, freedom of gun ownership, right? You have to exercise restraint. And this is more so if you are a man or a woman who carries a badge. So if you're a man or woman who carries a badge, you're expected to deal with unpleasantries. You're expected to deal with people spitting at you, kicking you, hitting you. Now you can respond with force, but just because someone decks you doesn't mean you shoot them. Just just because somebody grazes you with a car, it may hurt. You may actually break a bone. Doesn't mean that you kill them or her. This is the way Americans view things in general, and short of a very small group of people, this is the way Republicans view things. So those two incidences where people were killed for really what at best could be described, or worse could be described as behaving badly. Were they saying nice things? I don't know. Maybe they weren't the nicest things on the planet. Were they pushing back when they were pushed? That's against the law, right? That's within the tactics of the police. Police can respond forcibly. It's all within that box of what's allowable. But what's legally allowable, which these things may have been legally allowable, we don't know yet until the investigation is done. It would be problematic, right, if they were, but they might be. There's a lot of latitude on behalf of law enforcement. It doesn't mean that the public perception allows that. That's why there was such outcry for George Floyd, right? Are they legally allowable tactics? Turns out they weren't, but it's just it's overstretched by any imagination. People who have the power of killing you should have the exercise of restraint to not kill you, except in dire circumstances. that's this contract that we have. The citizenry can behave like bozos because they're not trained to moderate their tempers. They're not trained to moderate themselves and behave professionally. That's the difference. These people who are out there to protect us from the bad are themselves supposed to behave extraordinarily well. And it's a very high standard. And this failed, clearly, in both of those instances. And now we have 2 Americans dead. I don't think that sits well with any Americans. It's a problem.
Yeah. And, you mentioned George Floyd just a moment ago, Justin. Stephan, in terms of what doesn't sit well with Americans, there is absolutely a racial element to all of this in terms of who's being detained and who is being deported, in terms of who was shot and killed. You have two legal American citizens, both white. This sort of reminds me of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed and by a Ku Klux Klan and local law enforcement in Philadelphia, Mississippi. 2 of them were white. And that's when you did see that major pivot in terms of how the general public felt about the civil rights movement. Do we have that kind of similar moment? Because both Renee Good and Alex Preddy were both white. And so we didn't feel that when we had, Latinos, or when we're having Somalis in Minneapolis being detained and deported, but suddenly we're feeling this big surge of anxiety over, okay, well, where is this going? Where is this headed? Even with Trump voters who were saying, like I'll listen sometimes, listen in to C-SPAN's Morning Journal, and that's still anecdotal, but those are kind of snap surveys. But, a lot of Trump voters calling in and saying, hey, this is not what we signed on for when we voted for this. We were just like, let's stem down immigration. So where is this all? What gauge are we? How are you reading all this? How are you gauging all of this in terms of like the subject or the topic of race as it applies to this immigration issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to say that that's what really galvanized people to care about, right? It's the, as Justin was sort of saying, it's the tactics, it's what happened, it's the visuals, right? Now, arguably the fact that they're both white, and that I'm sure that brings maybe a few more people along on the like, oh my God, this is a huge problem. But I think the videos took care of that, regardless of white, brown, green, purple, whatever color the person would be. But and then the other big one is and now I'm going to forget his name also, but the 5-year-old who, with the Spider-Man backpack and the hat, who ICE was using as like a basically bait to like pull the parents out of the house, right? And that's another visual that just hits people home, right? And again, it's less about the color of the kid's skin, but just the fact that it's a kindergartner coming home from school with his backpack and with armed guards grabbing him and stuff like that. And then it is just, the whole thing is mind-boggling. But then the fact that this is like Abrego Garcia in Maryland, where I'm like, what is the administration doing where they're tripling down on trying to they're now trying to deport this kid. And it's just like, what are you doing? Like, it's just like, even if obviously I'm like not agreeing with anything that they're doing on this, just about every issue. But it's just like, just from a pure, like, are you trying to lose? It's like, why are you picking on a 5-year-old and his dad? Like, walk away. And move on to the next thing. But it just the way that they handled the post shooting of Alex, and just saying that he was brandishing a gun and obviously wasn't, and then they said, oh well, if you bring a gun to a protest, then you're basically doing something illegal, and then the NRA is like, okay, we can't go along with that. Like, what the hell are you people talking about? So it's just like, it's like amateur hour. But the amateurs are in charge, so this is what we get to deal with.
Yeah, so Justice also goes to this issue and intersects a bit with two other issues. One, the posting on social media of the Obamas is just highly offensive. Just know that there's enormous consensus around that. It's just highly offensive. We don't even want to go further into what exactly was posted, but you're having a big, huge backlash against that, even from Trump voters, even from Republicans who were saying that was totally unnecessary. Even Senator Tim Scott, who normally kind of out of South Carolina, who normally doesn't talk about these issues, is like that's just unacceptable. But are we going to see another issue being Bad Bunny during the halftime show at the Super Bowl, right? The NFL having to kind of navigate those issues in San Francisco. Ironically, too, the same stadium where former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick had played. When he played for that team, he's still, he's banned from the league. But let's talk about, under that kind of pressure, we see Trump ever showing any contrition, ever apologizing. Does this give us a glimpse into the future of how the administration continues to manage these issues, how the public manages these issues with the administration?
So the first thing, will Trump ever apologize? No. Trump comes from the school that apologies are a sign of weakness, right? You either belong in that school or you don't belong in that school. He belongs in that school. We don't even need to question whether the imagery was offensive. Of course it was offensive. Should never have been posted. Now, to get to the other thing, this Bad Bunny thing. So conservatives have rightfully railed against progressive entities, including universities and whatnot, who will allow people who aren't progressive, who come and speak, to be shouted down, to be booed out, to be assaulted as they're walking away. They've allowed this sort of thing in the past, and conservatives always said, this is nonsense. This is not free speech. We don't like this. If you don't like somebody, listen to what they're saying. Have a civilized dialogue. This, by the way, is the pinnacle of the argument around Charlie Kirk, right? That's why conservatives have put him up as this icon of conservative reasoning and interacting with each other as decent human beings. Now, when a musician disagrees with you, or an entertainer, or anyone, a medical doctor, whoever it might be, disagrees with you, if a Republican is abiding by this concept of free speech and respect for each other that they've trumpeted for 40 years, you can't hold a separate party because you don't agree with the Super Bowl show. You show up to the Super Bowl, you watch the show, you congratulate the person, even if the person takes a jab at you, because that's what civilized, decent adults do. You don't pick up your marbles and go home like Cartman. And I don't like it when Republicans behave like Cartman. It hasn't been the way they've behaved in the past. I'm not a ideological person, but that space was owned by a very particular group of very shrill ideologues. And it seems that Republicans, a certain set, are starting to adopt that and make it their own. And I'm very uncomfortable with that. I thought that I thought the whole thing was just childish and stupid. I don't think Americans don't buy into that. And do they agree that if someone sings in a different language, it's un-American? No. It's an absurdity. I don't know. Maybe there's a poll that's going to come out next week that says Americans hated the fact that Bad Bunny sang in Spanish, but it's just an absurdity on the face of it. He's an American,
and he is American. I mean, it is Puerto Rico, so it's an American territory.
We are the melting pot. There is not one of us here who is pure. In fact, frankly, we don't like that as Americans. We like our meltiness. We like the fact that we're a bunch of mongrels running around. That's our strength. That's what we like. We like that we're a composition of other cultures. That's a beautiful thing. Not in the concept that Republicans decry the diversity thing. I get that's charged. But I'm talking about we as a people, that we are all in this mishmash and we're combining. That is remarkable. There is magic there. There always has been. That's why America's been so incredibly dynamic. To sit there and say that someone is singing in Spanish and therefore it's un-American, It's just silly on the face of it. I mean, I've given it too much oxygen than it deserves.
Hey, Stefan, real quick question here, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Will Democrats can they mobilize voters, Latino voters, on the issue of detention, deportation, particularly around this ICE issue? Can they mobilize Black voters around the posting of, even into the summer around the posting of the Obamas as apes? So can they do this can they mobilize Latino voters again around the issue of Bad Bunny during the halftime show and about the reaction to that? Can they do that? Can they still hold on to these types of moments heading into the 2026 elections, like reminding people, hey, look at what happened here. Look at how these people are. And I mean, I'm sure some other moments or events between now and then are going to come up.
I mean, yes, right. And if they can't, then I don't know what we're doing as a party. I mean, I would say, I'm not positive the Democrats have the right leaders in place. In fact, I'm feeling pretty solid in saying that, right? Like that, Chuck Schumer is probably not our best choice of minority leader in the Senate, just because he's just too much. It's just not right for the time. And then, Hakeem Jeffries is, I would argue, doing a better job than Schumer, but I mean, he's in a little bit of a tougher position, but there's not, I mean, I think the concern is sort of who is going to sort of quote unquote rally the troops, right? Or who is pushing. Now, some of this is just so big that you don't even need someone like leading the charge, right? It's doing its own work, especially with Hispanic voters, African-American voters, but there has to be a feeling that something will change if you are going to make the effort to go vote and flip the lever for a Democratic candidate. Now, these are all isolated incidents and small sample sizes, right? But all the special elections that have been happening over the last few months, I mean, Democrats are overperforming by 15 points compared to where Trump was. Now, again, it's not quite apples to apples, but you're kind of looking at the overall sort of sway of things, right? And there's just no arguing that it's not going in the favor of Democrats. And I'm not really seeing a way that Republicans could sort of right the ship, or that we're rolling into November of this year where people are like, actually, I think the Republicans are doing a great job. I guess never say never. 6 months, 7 months, whatever it is that we're at is a lifetime in politics, but that feels unlikely, especially given who's in the White House. And now the one thing I find fascinating about Bad Bunny at doing the halftime show is I think the NFL and Roger Goodell are one of the only corporations, I'll put it in the corporation category, that seems to be just like, I don't care what Trump thinks, where, head of Google, Microsoft, I mean, even Cook from Apple, went to the White House to see the Melania premiere on the same day that Alex Preddy got shot. So I mean, there was bootlicking going on everywhere in corporate America, apparently, except for the NFL, who then I just loved double down when people are like, we need white Americans singing. And they're like, okay, we'll have Green Day do the opening. Where it's like, I mean, the only thing better maybe is if Rage Against the Machine did a comeback tour for the Super Bowl. But other than that, they it was pretty much just sticking it out of the White House. And I mean, it just fascinates me that this is the organization, this is the one and only organization out there that's just I don't give a crap. And we're going to do what's good for us. And expanding our audience, moving into new markets is what's in our interest, and this is where our markets are going, and so we're going to do it.
I wanted to talk with you real quick, Justin. I want you to start with this regulatory rollbacks. So ultra-conservative, anti-climate activists, advocates have been very successful. They finally came into, and this is also just talking about what a recent New York Times investigative piece was talking about. I mean, they finally come to the point where they've nearly rolled back all climate regulations, nearly dismantled what the country has been doing in terms of responding to climate change, climate crisis. So what does the future look like in terms of climate regulations, not just in terms of what's happening on the federal level. Well, we can kind of see what's happening on the federal level, but also how does that impact what's going on in the state and local level as well?
Well, climate regulations are a murky world with voter opinion, right? They're broadly people support being good stewards of the environment and the concept of environmental regulations. Where the fracture comes in is where it gets a little bit more complex, and I think Republicans are right to put the brakes on some of it. We'll see, whether this pans out to be overall a positive thing or if it has unintended consequences. But the reality is the fast approach to these regulations has been driven by the belief that we're going over an edge very soon, and therefore the appetite or the ability to stomach severe pain on behalf of the regular person was okay. If you can't buy a car anymore for $20,000, they all cost $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 because those car companies are investing hundreds of billions of dollars in new technologies to meet emission standards. Meanwhile, electricity is more expensive because not only we're using more of it, we're producing less of it because we're moving towards these purely environmentally clean components. There's a challenge there. So in fact, if you look at voter opinion, you can identify why that problem exists in the dichotomy, right? They broadly, yes, keep our air clean or water clean, our land clean. On the other hand, if you ask people to write a check for it, there's almost no appetite whatsoever, even like $100 check or whatever you want to call it, like a carbon tax or a clean carbon fee or whatever it might be. There's no appetite for that. The reason why is just this stuff is really, really expensive. I think the Democratic Party and environmentalists have moved the pendulum too far, too fast. And now they're dealing with a very real repercussion of it that may have serious consequences for the environment. I don't know yet. But the damage to regular Americans is clear. I mean, they're paying an extraordinary amount for benefits that they don't really see as making a dramatic change in their lives. That's basically where I think voters
just
see
some
it right now.
a couple follow-up questions, Justin. However, Inflation Reduction Act was providing benefits in terms of major economic projects, renewable energy projects, and primarily red states. Now those projects being shut down, and so less jobs being created as a result of that. And once again, with red states and Republican districts. Another thing too is renewable energy, clean energy, as we show as it continues to grow. It costs less money. I mean, to implement those types of projects, right? To bring down rates, costs less money in terms of implementation. Also, there's it's helping. It's mitigating the impacts of climate change, which we all agree is there. So it is happening. So I mean, how does that all kind of align with or not how it aligns, but how does that reconcile with the argument that okay, well, there's a problem here, that this is all costing too much?
Well, very easily. I mean, a number of things that you said there are not shared by everybody. They're shared by Democrats and a certain group of independents, but they're not universally agreed to. I do a decent amount of work in this space. We all do in public policy, but I mean, what the majority and the supermajority of Americans support is a basket of energy alternatives that allows for this shift towards cleaner. Everyone wants cleaner, but I think Americans are very clear-eyed about what cleaner means today, and we're not quite there yet. Even when I talk to progressive policymakers, when we're looking at the targets that were being set during the end days of the Biden administration, there is a high degree of skepticism as were those realistic, and the costs that would take to build out infrastructure and all these sorts of things was prohibitively high. It's just you're moving too far too fast. And the argument of yes, things get cheaper when they achieve scale. Americans are capable of understanding that. They do understand that. They get it. But they also understand that speed compresses compresses the cost to get to scale. And there is someone who pays for that. Right? It's not the federal government. The federal government doesn't pay for anything. The federal government uses money that you and I pay them to pay for stuff. Or that we pay for those higher, more expensive products to pay for stuff. So they understand that. It's on the backs of the consumer. And they're willing to pay for it up to a point. And right now, there is no elasticity. I think this is a burden that the speed of that arc was just too much, and I think the Democrats are going to have to pay for that in the short term. Hopefully, they'll be a little bit more careful about it in the future. But and again, even the term of we all agree about this is improving climate change. I mean, that agreement doesn't exist in the eyes of voters. There is large agreement that climate change exists. But there still is not, uniform agreement that what these things have done have affected the progress of climate change in any meaningful way, at least at the voter level. And I can only talk about what voters think. So I don't think that it's as universal as you describe it. And without question, people do recognize that they're paying for it. And they believe they're paying too much too fast. Doesn't mean they don't want clean air. Doesn't mean they don't like the idea of clean energy. They do. They want all of this stuff. But they also want to own a home, right? They want to own a car that doesn't cripple them for 30 years. They want all these things that are actually fairly basic wants. And they're getting priced out of that space, not least of which because energy is so doggone expensive. These things have long tails.
Stephen, your thoughts on this, and also in terms of, can't make it, especially for red states, red district voters, can't make this really a climate change issue, but you can make it an economic issue in terms of the potential benefits of clean energy projects. I mean, I don't know, what are Democrats thinking? How are they viewing this issue? What are they seeing in the polls? And could it be, if you frame it more in terms of the economy, especially in terms of high energy rates, the higher energy bills that people are paying as a result of a reliance on conventional or traditional fossil fuel technology or energy. Could that be a major issue heading into 2026?
Overall cost, yes, right. But I think the environment and energy, I still a lifetime away, like I said before, right? But it would be shocking to me if those were a top 5 issue coming into this election, right? Like just more than a lot more going on that's going to take up more oxygen. And this is always a tricky issue in that, right? I think like the science is universally agreed to, just about outside of some side crackpots of like, is climate change happening or not? But and we've let it go for too long already. And the longer we keep going, the more and more expensive it's going to become to try to fix or to try to move the arc in the other direction. So if we keep kicking down the can in the road, this just becomes more and more expensive. Now, for elected officials, not their problem, right? Like they're concerned about the next election. They're not worried about an election 30 years from now. So you sort of have it's tough to make the argument for the hey, everyone needs to pay even more because that's like the only thing that's really going to make this change. Whatever that, obviously that wouldn't be the argument that you would make directly. But it's a tough sell, right? Like it's like, oh, hey, look, we need to raise taxes because people want more services. We need to pay more for these services. Is not typically a winning issue or winning message in an election. People want to be able to eat cake, lose weight, and not have to exercise. And elected officials will promise those things because that's what gets you elected. But we kind of all know at the end of the day, at some point in time, it's going to come back to bite us, and that's what we're looking at here. And what the administration is doing is not just sort of rolling back some of these climate things, but they're just trying to gut the regulations. And for 99% of businesses, probably, like this isn't really going to have an effect, but they seem to be really happy to do things for, like that 1% where this is going to have a bigger effect. But, people always say, "Oh, I want regulation," but it's like, okay, do you want like companies dumping sewage into the lake, in your near your house? Do you want, do you want clean drinking water? Do you want your kids to be able to play outside? And obviously, people want clean air, they want clean water, they don't want sewage getting dumped into their lake. But if you just completely gut the regulatory system, that's what you're going to get. That's what you're going to end up with.
Yeah, even some folks, some industries, even fossil fuel industry, the fossil fuel industry is saying that it's a little bit too extreme with some of this regulatory rollbacks. So making them feel a little bit uncomfortable. They were saying such in the first Trump administration, saying that now what's happening in the second Trump administration. But just throw this out here real quick to you both. You can jump in. So credibility, we all agree, is the top issue heading into the next elections, which I would think would link up with energy bills. People are tired of paying for rising energy bills, right? So, and how do you bring all of that down, combined with a deregulated environment, which contributes to, or at least as voters kind of put things together, one and one together, saying, well, maybe this is what's doing it. This is what's raising my electricity bills. And so how do both parties reconcile that? How do they contend that? Who wants to jump in on that? I'll go ahead, Justin.
Oh, sure. Well, this will be very simply sorted out. So what you've just described, I think, is a step or two away from the talking points that'll actually be effective. What it'll come down to is, do people feel that their wallets buy more or less or the same as they did a year ago? And they were really unhappy with what their wallets were able to buy a year ago. And at that point, it'll be 2 years, right? And if it stayed the same, they're going to vote against the party in office. And if it's gotten worse, they're going to vote against the party in office. So the only question is, in these last few months, is that going to get better? And if it gets better, that is Republicans' hope. All the other items are all supporting cast. But it is as simple as that. It is that sentiment. And sentiment trails economic reality, right? So our buying power may increase, but we don't feel that it increased for several months. It doesn't sink in. So it's a much shorter time than it looks like. Now, I'm sure Republicans will make the argument that deregulation is affecting people's pocketbook, but the argument is meaningless unless people's pocketbooks actually feel fatter and more capable. And I find I'm struggling to see how that happens. Now, I also felt that mid-year last year, we would see really high price spikes as the cost of tariffs trickled through the economy. We didn't see those, right? But we certainly haven't seen dramatic cost decreases, nor have we seen dramatic increases in people's purchasing power because their incomes have gone up relative to costs. So, there are. I still, I can't argue against what I think is historical norms, and that is, how does the economy get that much better? How do people's purchasing power get that much better in between now and the midterms, which is critical, and then that longer window for the general? It's a hell of an uphill climb. I don't see how Republicans make that happen.
Yeah, how do Democrats make that happen? Stefan, real quick.
Democrats aren't in charge, so they don't have to make it happen, right? And so, I'd agree, right? It's just, it is rare, or certainly I can't think of a historical point in time where an economy turned on a dime in the positive way in a 6-month period, right? And so it is hard to imagine that we're dealing with a different type of landscape in November. Things can go in the worst direction pretty quickly, but not sort of in the opposite. Now, gas prices, those will go up and down. They always do. But grocery prices, the more day to days, we know the healthcare is baked in for the year. And so those are, and college isn't going to become free overnight. So again, to Justin's point, right? Like, it is hard to picture or envision that there's all of a sudden a change and everyone's feeling much more flush. Oh, I'm spending a lot less money for the same things. Isn't life great? Coming into November.
All right, Stephen Hankin gets the last word. Stephen Hankin of Lincoln Park Strategies, also Trendancy. Go to lpstrategies.com or trendancy.com for more information there. And also Justin Wallen's been joining us. Jay Wallen Opinion Research. Go to jaywallen.com for more there. I'm Charles Ellison. You can catch me at thebnote.com. You can subscribe there. Also watch this episode of What Happens Next, as you can watch it elsewhere as well. You can find it on LinkedIn. So always good to talk with you, gentlemen. I always learn a lot. So look for us in the next month, in March. I hope we should have something in March. So I think we will. And great discussion there. All right. That ends this episode. See you next time. Be safe out there.